So I got this comment, and I think it misunderstood what I was trying to say about the Swahili coast. And it said, "Did Africans build armor?" And of course, it says, "Yes, Africans built armor, used armor, which included both metal and non-metal types. Common forms included quilted armor made of thick, layered cotton or cloth, which was prevalent in West and Central Africa, as well as metal armor like chainmail and iron cuirasses, particularly in the Sahel region." Now, I want to make sure that people understand what I was trying to say. So I'm going to play the video in which he reacted to. And I want to show people that I was talking about the Swahili coast and why in that region we've never really found armor. We found things that could be, but for the most part, they just look like a ring or something. But we don't find in the Swahili coast. And my point of the video was there's not a lot of people in the Swahili coast. In fact, when they go to war, they have to rely on heathens, as they would call them, who live further out or further in the continent. When you squeeze a specific type of information, for example, how many people lived in that area, how many of them were involved in war, would you really invest in something like military grade weapons of that time, like armor and stuff, for 20,000 people? So already you can tell what I'm talking about. I'm saying if you have 20,000 people, if you squeeze the information, we have 20 in Kilwa, there's about 20,000 people max. That's like at its highest. It's a small island. And a lot of those places in the Swahili coast are islands, rather than like Mozambique Island. That was an island. Most of those places have 20,000 people max. And then they have another group like Melinda. Then you have whatever, all of them, but you have pieces of 20,000. And as I'm asking there, would you invest in armor in with 20,000 people? How big is your army going to be? That 20,000, by the way, includes men, women, children. It's not 20,000 men, it's 20,000 people. So would they invest in armor? And the answer is no. And one of the things that makes them not is because they've got a natural defense, which is called the ocean, right? The sea right there is acting as a defense. A secondary defense is the fact that they have large supporters from other parts. Remember when Vasco da Gama came down to the Swahili coast, they could just send people, and this is why they had such a deep communication thing going on. They could just send people to go fetch more people, and these people would come from the outerlands and or the inlands and go towards the coast to chase out what enemy was there. In the times of the Ottomans, they used the Ottomans as their supply. The Ottomans supplied them with guns, which they already had. Everybody pretty much had them by the time the Ottomans got there, but they supplied them with more guns. They supplied them with lances and other types of stuff and backed them up with boats. As people who live close by the ocean, the thing that they worried about the most was naval supremacy. So now we're going to go back. I'm going to play the rest of the video. I'm going to butt in every now and then because I want to make sure you understand what I was trying to say. And then I'm going to go and talk about the armor and the regions that had the armor. And it wasn't just the Sahel area. And would you, if you lived in Angola, knowing how big your population is, build something like armor? And why didn't they build armor? So here I'm talking about Angola this time, and I'm comparing it because Angola had a large population compared to the large population of warriors. I mean, the estimation is about 1 million compared to the Swahili coast. But this place also didn't have armor, but they did have metal shields. They did have all kinds of things like that, wooden shields, metal shields, and stuff like that. And the question, of course, that I'm asking here is why didn't the people in Angola, because they don't have the same problems as the people in the Swahili coast, it's not a small amount of people. And the answer here is they relied on their numbers more than they relied on defensive things. Because there was so many of them, they relied mostly on that. And this is true of the Monomatapa as well. In fact, one of the Portuguese who sees them literally says that these people were traveling with shields, and they literally put them down and go attack people with just a spear and a bare chest. So it's not that these people couldn't have done. They just had way too many people. In fact, the difference between this civilization and a lot of those that are described in the Sahel, in Angola and Congo and those areas, the difference between them and the people who lived in that West African, Central African area, North Africa too, because they had armor there too, the reason why they're described differently is because while they also lived in the coast, so they also relied on naval supremacy, but they also relied on the numbers more than anything else, relied on the fact that no one is going to crush them, not with the numbers that they have. Europeans with their guns meant nothing at the time. And of course, only when the Europeans came later with really endless numbers, because they kept fetching more people from Europe when they got defeated, only then did they stand a chance in those areas. I mean, we know that Africans built all kinds of things with metals, some metals that didn't even exist in Europe and Asia. So why didn't they build armor? Maybe even small armor in the case of like a circle in on the chest just to protect you from that. So I can see why this part is the part that confused them. So basically, I didn't put in some pronouns there that would have probably helped direct who I was talking about. So I said that we know that Africans built all kinds of armor. That's where I was talking about all Africans in general. Then I was trying to reduce it back to these. So why didn't these guys, whether it's the, well, really I was talking about the people from Angola. Why didn't the people in Angola, which we know they're perfectly capable of building, you know, any kind of metal stuff, because we've seen them, even stuff that people in Europe didn't have, we've seen them build. So why didn't they build the armor that you see in other parts of Africa? Is what I was trying to say. As this was the last 30 seconds of the video, and in the video, everybody saw I didn't talk about West Africa or North Africa in detail, but you know, let's just carry on because this is the last 30 seconds of the video, which I was talking about this. In an earlier position in the video, I even make the comparison between West Africa, the Swahili areas, and Angola. And we'll listen to that before I get straight into the armor. Because, of course, West Africa is unique in that they use armor a lot. But it is also unique in that they don't have raised army or typically ready armies in the same way that the South African regions have. We'll get back to that. Ebola or the Kingdom of Congo, you can easily see the difference. But technologically, there are things that the Swahili coast had that are worlds apart from what the people had in Angola and any of those other regions, really. But of course, that is not the secret ingredient, which is having a much smaller population that is more concentrated and more concentrated, meaning fixed as a population. Because obviously, we have West Africa where they have inventions that didn't exist in other parts of the world until later. I mean, like stamps, for example, these wooden stamps that exist in West Africa, you don't find them anywhere else in Africa until later dates. So I could start off by pointing out helmets in these several different locations, like this metal brass helmet created by the people of Benin in Nigeria. So in yellow, I will color all the places in Africa that at least had armor being typical in their region. So, in other words, they had it to a level where it mattered in terms of war. The red line is where I will show where the Bantu people, who typically, but sometimes, did not have armor, And the last one I will show is the Swahili coast. This area, it lacked things that both Angola, or the Bantu people in those regions, and West and Central Africa had. Now, keep in mind, I'm not saying that the Swahili coast never had armor at any point. I'm saying that they didn't spend most of their time investing in war-like devices, and the reason was because their sort of cornerstone was markets, was selling to people, was trade. That's the thing that they sort of put all their eggs in, and you can see how small groups like the Mogadishu and all of those, they just come in and they do as they please, and deals are made and things like that. Now, were there wars fought in those regions? Absolutely. But if we follow the words of Ibn Battuta, and if we follow the earlier Muslims, which we will look into right now, because they depict these people, and they talk about how these people had these armor and metal weapons. We will get back to that. Now, remember, literally, West Africa in basically invented metal usage in those areas. So it's no surprise that West Africa would have the most abundant amount of armor and different types of metals as well. Again, we'll get back into that, that didn't even exist in Europe. And these metals include, basically traps, or in other words, cutting up little shards of things and then leaving them like thorns on the ground. So they cut the thing up a little bit, they cut it up, and then they leave it on the ground, and then they move away. And you will see that this type of trapping system also exists in Angola, not the cutting of little blades, but they have this system where tactics are more important to some of these people than straightforward battles. Even the strategic locations seem to be a result of constant war. And you can see that these people engaged in constant war, and they grew their territories and shrunk their territories all the time. This is why these places focus so much more on war. In fact, if you read Ibn Battuta, you can see that almost every place that he goes to, all he's talking about is basically trade and all of that, and war. He talks about who the Sultan is. He talks about who else is in charge besides the Sultan. He talks about local areas, and then he talks about the people who are battling one another. When he gets to Kilwa, and then when he gets to other places in those areas like Mombasa and all of those places, you start hearing him talk more about sailing, markets, the people who live in that area. Whereas when he goes directly to places like Mogadishu, when he goes to places like Yemen, when he goes to places like Mali, when he goes to Niger, when he goes to Sudan, Egypt, war is at the tip of his tongue all the time. This is the difference in why the Swahili coast does not develop that far into the future when it comes to weapon building. And of course, strategically, most of those places are like islands, or are islands. And again, in order to protect an island, you don't really need armor, you need ships. And if you have ships, you have the ability to protect yourself. So, of course, I bring up Ibn Battuta because he immediately talks about the armor, especially in the Mali kingdom. And he says, the Sultan sits on the Banbi after the afternoon prayer. The armor bearers come with splendid weapons, quivers of gold and silver, swords ornamented in gold, as are the scabbards, spears of gold and silver, and maces of crystal. Four emirs stand by his head, driving off the flies in their hands. They have a silver ornament like a stirrup. So let's start from the east side of Africa, since that's the place that I was talking about, and go western until we get to the very ends of the western areas. So obviously, the Mamluks obviously had armor, and then if we go to the Blemmyes area, we know that they had armor because they are described by some of the people living in the area. When we say the Blemmyes, we're of course talking about the Beja people who are described as having armor. Most of the Beja rely on shields for defense, but there are writers who definitely saw them wearing chainmail and also definitely saw them wearing plates for protection in the cases of war. By the time that they were writing, the Beja had already converted to Islam. Much of what is considered Beja territory was colonized by what is known as the Funj Sultanate. Ultimately, they are the same type of people, somewhat nomadic in their existence, like most Nilo Saharans are, which is why they move around, as I said in my previous video. But if we focus specifically on Ethiopia, we can see that the same tradition, which we'll have to admit here, during the wars in the Funj Sultanate, the Ethiopians also got horses to fight against some of the Sokoto and some of these other people who existed in that area. And we see this warriors atop of horses, who the horses also have cotton quilts to defend themselves. Underneath, unseen to the normal eye, are two more defenses, one made of leather and the other one made of plates. They also have, as you can see with this warrior, they also have eye shields. This is very important, of course, because without the eyes, there is no horse, really. Now, this was not just something that happened, which the Ethiopians themselves talk about in many books, including the Cabernet Gas, but it's something that became even more expressed when they teamed up with other Sudanic people or Sudanic people. Now, something that you notice is that, like the Japanese, these people have the same tradition of looking normal on the outside. To an unsuspecting person, they might not even look like they were wearing armor, but underneath, of course, tightly woven plates and even metal parts with which are like what's the word I'm looking for, braces, but thicker, in order for someone not to be able to stab limbs and things like that. Now, there is a European who commented on the defenses of these people and talked about how, obviously, this is his opinion, that not even one person of the Abyssinians died during the time before the Europeans came and waged war with the Abyssinians. And he puts that down as a result of their defenses, that their defenses was so good that not even one person lost their life. And he says here, the next is called Lika Magwas, an officer that always goes before the king to hinder the pressure of the crowd. In war, when the king is marching, he rides constantly round him at a certain distance and carries his shield and his lance. At least he carries a silver shield, and his lance pointed with the same metal, before such kings as do not choose to expose their persons. No prince ever lost his life in battle till the coming of the Europeans to Abyssinia, when both the excommunicating and the murder of their sovereign happened at the same time. The next part is about an area in Sudan called Sennar, which follows through the Nile. In this location in the 1700s, a European sees the Funj sultanates, and he goes past someone called Adelan, who happened to be the king at the time. And this person bears all the fruit of what you would expect of a sultan to have at that time. But the thing that is most important is that he is shown wearing chainmail, again, something that is very typical for these areas, the Sudanic areas, whether it's Makuria, Dongola, Sennar, Adel, any of these regions. They wore chainmail, they wore plates of armor, they wore all kinds of things. Now, this will have to be a bit of a long reading because we have to get all the way into the differences of the type of clothes and what impression they left on this European. Within the gates was a number of horses, with the soldiers' barracks behind them. They were all picketed in ranks, their faces to their master's barracks. It was one of the finest sights Mr. Bruce ever saw of the kind. They were all above 16 hands high, of the breed of the old Saracen horses, and finely made, and as strong as our coach horses, but exceedingly nimble in their motion, rather thick and short in their forehead, but with the most beautiful eyes, ears, and heads in the world. They were mostly black, some of them black and white, some of them milk white, fouled, so not white by age, with white eyes and white hooves. Not perhaps a great recommendation. A steel shirt of mail hung upon each man's quarters, opposite to the horse, and by it an antelope skin made soft like chamois, with which it was covered from the dew of the night. A headpiece of copper without a crest or plumage was suspended by a lace above the shirt of mail, and was the most picturesque part of the trophy. To these was added an enormous broadsword in the red leather scabbard, and upon the pommel hung two thick gloves, not divided into fingers as ours, but like hedgers' gloves, their fingers in one poke. They told Mr. Bruce that within the enclosure at Aria there were 400 horses, which with the riders and armors complete for each of them, were all the property of Sheikh Adelan, every horseman being his slave and brought with his money. So I hope that covers the sources of the Funj areas having armor, and the Sudanic people having armor, and the Beja people having armor. Then we go, let's first go a little bit east to Abraha, who was the first person to conquer Yemen, and he is described as wearing armor. In fact, this is a drawing of him, not a very good one, but yes, this is him riding elephants to the Kaaba to go and destroy it. He is immortalized inside of the Quran and other books. This is Shandara ibn Shaddad, and Andara was a Ethiopian whose father was also Ethiopian, well, mother was also Ethiopian, and he represented the Abyssinians that happened to live inside of Yemen and also happened to live in the pre-Islamic era. These warriors, these Ethiopian warriors, were very dominant in those areas, and you can see that they are portrayed wearing chainmail. They're basically knights. Now, I've talked about this person before, and I'm just using him as a symbol. You can find hundreds of these people from the Yemenite areas if you go and look in the right areas, which are talked about by the Yemenites, the Saudi Arabians. They even describe African warriors as some of the most skilled ones. And you can imagine them being paid over and over again by new Arab rulers who want to make sure that their victory is sealed. This is a map that will help us greatly to understand exactly the areas that we're talking about. Now, there's another group of people who are called the Shukriya. These people are under the Funj Sultanate, and they are known as the strongest warriors of the Sudanese type people, or the Funj Sultanate. Another well armed militia is the Sultanate of Darfur. I won't get into too much detail. Basically, it's the same as the Adil Sultanate, except they have deep communications with places like India, for example. Going further west, we see two tribes beautifully portrayed in the 1700s. On the one riding the horse that is not covered is Bornu. And Bornu, of course, is a part of the state of Kanem. But this person on the horse, who's covered completely with the cotton, which then would be underneath a armor that is more than the cotton, which stops arrows and stuff like that, even slashes. But more than that, this person is from the Bagarumi. Now, I've already shown the Bagarumi before. It's from this image, right? The Bagarumi, which are part of the Kanem Bornu Empire, are seen here, basically waiting. And in later images, we see that these warriors are some of the, well, basically, this is a tributary state to the Kanem Bornu areas. In other words, it's a state sort of created for the purposes of the Kanem Bornu to have people to call on and stuff like that. And just like the rest of the Nilo-Saharan regions, they travel from one place to another. They're semi-nomadic. Seen above these are two warriors of one the Bornu areas, the other is a trader of Timbuktu. He over here is written as a Falata. A Falata is just another word for a Fulani. So he is a Fulani of Timbuktu. These ones we could put somewhere there near Sudan and Nigeria because these are the areas that would be most close. And then now let's go to proper Nigeria, a bit far away from the Bornu areas, and see exactly what we get. Of course, I started with this helmet earlier, but if you look at some of the early images of the people of Benin, you can see that they have leather and other soft things coming out of their head underneath their helmets. This is to soften the blow when they get hit on the helmet. We know from gathered evidence, of course, the helmet is one of them, that the people of Benin utilized iron, well, not iron, but metal shields all over the place. And then they covered it with leather to conceal the shields, of course. This is not necessarily to hide it from the enemy, because some of the enemies did the same thing, but in some cases it was effective. And we'll read here: relief plaque, lost wax cast in brass, narrow plaque rectangular in the form within side flanges, background surface decorated with a river leaf pattern and stippling, two nail holes at the top of the right, blah, blah, blah. In the corners depicts a single standing warrior or courtier figure facing front, holds ebon sword in the left hand, further sword on the left side, wears tall helmet with stiff front panels and horsehair at the sides, protrusium atop deep beaded collar leopard tooth necklace, quadrilangular bell, body armor, armlets, beaded anklets, and patterned wrap around knee length skirt. Here is another image, but this one shows what is underneath more than the other. And it's a T shaped helmet. And you can see atop of the person's head, the helmet, that underneath there is another version of a helmet right underneath. That one is made out of lesser materials than the one at the top that's made out of, well, metal. And so you can see there, it says, if we really blah 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 blah, depicts single standing bearded musician facing front, holds stringed instrument upright, both hands, has coiled side plate on left side, wears helmet with cowrie shells and T-shaped front piece, central feather from top of helmet, figure wears coiled neck ring, blah 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 blah, and body armor, coiled bracelets. Quite clearly he's not your average musician. He's a warrior musician. And you can see there that he is very prepared for war and basically, again, armor in these areas. And you must remember that when these were brought or stolen by Europeans and then brought back in some cases, but when these were stolen by Europeans, these ones are already like 100 years old, and these ones were taken by the Europeans in the late 1800s. And again, remember, these are already old by the time that they're taken. They're not depicting something that's happening at the exact same time, obviously. To know full detail, of course, of the people of Benin, we would have to read people like Alfred Dapper, which we can do another time because I think it's getting too long, the video. But we can read people like Alfred Dapper. We can read others as well who engage with Benin. The typical thing is that there are plates rather than the type that you would see in Bornu or in the other Sudanic areas, chainmail and stuff like that. Now, of course, something that we have to appreciate about a lot of these kingdoms is that a lot of the time it's not every single warrior dressed this way. But another reason why I'm leaving this on here is because of the numbers again. Benin can only raise about 30,000 people to go to war, whereas the king of Congo can raise 100,000 in a day to come have war with him. And he did in some cases. In fact, some of the princes can raise about 30,000 people. We're talking about princes of small regions of the Kingdom of Congo. That is why, for them, it was not helmets or any of that stuff that mattered. It was the size of your army because they were a warrior race. With the other side of West Africa, the Senegambian regions, you will see that there are people who are described in those areas as having body shields or body plates that protect them from many, many attacks. Now, of course, it's nowhere near the coverage that you get in places like the Mali Empire or Songhai, whatever you want to call it, the Kanem Bornu regions, the Niger, the several Niger kingdoms, Tunisia. Of course, we don't even need to get into Tunisia, all of those areas at the top in the north. And of course, Morocco, because it's so close to the Western areas, also utilized both methods, African methods of armor, but then they also utilized European methods of armor. And basically, the Atlantic Ocean is a area for great trade. And the Dutch explorer, whose picture that I'm showing right now from his book, he tells us that there's several things that cannot happen to these people in Senegambia. And also he writes a bit about Benin, but he tells us, he's from the 1600s, by the way, and he tells us that these guys are basically impenetrable as a society. they have many civilizations, and of course they have many shields and stuff like that that protect them from enemies, although some do fight naked. Well, he means bare chested, just like the people of Benin did, and some of the people of Bornu did, and some of the people of Ethiopia do too. Now, this is an image of the Jollofs, and the Jollofs are one of the greatest people of that area. And again, depending on where you are in Western Central Africa, you will have different levels of armor utilized. But something again that you will see is that most of these places don't have very, very, very large armies. I mean, the accusation in some of the kingdoms further south is that they have like a million people in there. If they want to, they can just take a million people and go to war. Now, that is probably not true, but it is at least written down as a possibility. Now, what I will say is that when we read some of the few things about how they protect themselves from weapons, you'll see the same things like the Zulu long shield made out of leather, made out of skin. And you will also see some shields made out of wood, but you will not get armor, not in this area. If you want to know about more about the armor, I mean, I will cover it, but if you want to know more about it, you can go back to my talks about West Africa. I will link some of them where I talked about West Africa and how some of these warriors were basically the end of European invasion because they were just too strong to be defeated. And even some of the islands were suspicious of the Europeans, and so they would not trade with them, forcing them to go far south into places like Congo, having relief, knowing that these people in Congo did not have full suspicion like the people in West Africa. And of course, they couldn't just barge in and try to take over because what did these people not have? They had guns too, as well, at some point. But yeah, we'll get back to that at some other time. Thank you very much. Like, share, subscribe. I was supposed to make another video. I was going to make it on the populations of Africa. I wanted to do piece by piece, saying which pieces are where, if you put them together, how many people of Africa would there be? And that's why I started with the Swahili coast and Angola rather than doing the entire continent, because I don't think it's possible to calculate it in even a few weeks. You need to kind of make sure you look around.